Last week, amongst other things, we took a look at King David as he sat on the throne some 3,000 years ago, according to our calendars today, as he put pen to parchment and came up with what we call Psalm 22. It's a particular piece of writing that had to do with some of David's circumstances, but a much greater reach than that was presented when he began describing crucifixion. Something that David never experienced, was not part of Israel's national life at that time in any way, shape, or form, and was instituted over 8 centuries following David's time by the Romans. But he was, again, compelled by God himself to record certain things that were, in effect, a prelude, a partial fulfillment, what do you call it? Today we'd call it in the movie world, I guess, a trailer, okay, to kind of generate interest, just a couple of highlights to kind of go, whoa, I'd like to see the whole thing unfold. Well, the whole thing unfolded some 1,000 years after David wrote, with the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, being crucified. We saw that, and one of the things that we find ourselves asking, if you've got kind of a curious mind, is, well, then what next? Crucifixion. For the Romans, it was putting to death people who were criminals, capital punishment, and it's, judgment being carried out and so forth. Mankind's philosophers, you see, have always wrestled with, we got philosophy major here, any minors? Once again, I'm all by myself. Yeah, where did man come from? Where is he going to? And what is the purpose of his existence on this earth? Those great 3 questions that men have wrestled with for thousands of years have wound up turning into books piled, head high across the length of this room. There have been thousands of tomes that have been presented as possible explanations. God wrote very clearly about this very issue, and we have to kind of put things in perspective a little bit, following the question of what next following crucifixion. For whether it was King David's era or something else prior to Christ's death, burial, and resurrection, the question would be, well, what happens after a man dies? Where does he go? What is the next thing on this slate, so to speak? Now, we're going to be spending a little bit of time today in the book of Job, where David brought our scripture reading. But Job is philosophical to a great degree. It's also very convoluted as far as its arguments, and it has a series of spirals that we're not going to get into. But the main theme is what we, in the theological realm, would call theodicy. And we'll just put it down in blue-collar stuff. Why do righteous people suffer? What is the purpose? What is God's plan? How do we allow for righteous people suffering? Chapters 1 and 2 of the book of Job are the preliminary setting. We don't have time to go into it. We're going to be spending our time in other places in the book. But chapters 1 and 2 describe the apostle, just went blank. I just happened to notice something and my wand went sideways right there. So pardon me while I get it back squared away a little bit here. It gives a description of Job. Now, Job is probably one of the older characters, and the events described in the book of Job predate Abraham. Probably goes back at least 500 to 1,000 years before Abraham. That would be about 2500 BC, 2800 BC, and some put him 1,000 years earlier even than that, which goes back a long ways. We see some unique descriptions. There's no mention of a priesthood, no mention of a worship system, no mention of a tabernacle or a temple. It predates all of that. In fact, Job is the one, as the head of his household, that is bringing the recognition of a righteous God in his existence to his own family. And God considers him to be a righteous man in his generation. And it's stated that way as the book opens. And then the scene shifts a little bit to a picture of heaven itself, where you have a dialogue that develops between Lucifer, Satan, we call him. Lucifer was his pre-fall name, which means day star or light of the day or light of the morning, before he rebelled against God. And while we don't know, because Scripture doesn't really nail it down tight, obviously there is some way of Satan being able to present himself in the very courtroom of the throne of God. Okay? Now, he fell from his position with his rebellion against God, but there's a lot more to it than that. And it's, I'll just, tantalize with you with that and say we'll deal with that another day as well, because it's not the point of what we want to cover right now. Okay. But we find an argument that Satan presents to God about Job being righteous. And he says, well, the reason that he honors you is you've treated him so well. You've given him a nice family, you've given him a prestige in the community, you've given him wealth and herds, and good health and everything else. But he says Satan's argument was if you took it away from him, Job would curse you to his face. And God says, okay, put your money down. Okay? Because I don't think Job is that shallow. I think that a man that is truly of faith is not going to cut and run just because his circumstances change. And so a contest, if you want to call it that, develops between God and Satan to prove whether Job is in fact righteous because of being treated well or because of his faith relationship to his creator God. Okay? Now, it's kind of an interesting contest. You got to come back another day. That's another message. What I will say is God is willing to prove Job's righteousness even with satanic attack. Okay? Also, God is willingness to subject believers to trials and afflictions to prove the validity of genuine faith, even when the believer, from a human point of view, struggles, and even when the believer fails. Okay, God is willing to subject his people to those kind of trials. Now you think, I don't like where this message is going. It's okay to talk about old dead Job, but as soon as you put it into the us or the we category of believers of all ages, all of a sudden you're getting a little too close to home, because I would rather have comfort and prosperity and long life and a lot of money, and whatever else, it happens to be. Okay. Well, God does a pretty good job of taking in the entire realm of Job's world. He deals with his finances, he wipes him out. He deals with the emotions, makes him absolutely miserable. He deals with the loss of prestige, his peer group, says there's obviously something wrong with him. He's even got family difficulties. Not number one, his kids are all killed in the process. And number two, his wife's counsel is, why don't you just curse God and die and get it over with? Nothing like a little marital support from the home front, I mean, really, it's, you're toast, just, crawl in a hole and call it good, okay? So you have all of that in the first 2 chapters that is there, and then you have something additional. If you have your Bibles there and you are looking at Job, right in front of the book of Psalms, not too far, you find when you get to the latter portion of chapter 2, you find the introduction of Job's 3 friends. Now there's a 4th one that appears, or at least an associate, maybe not in the same category, that appears later in the book. But here you have, in verse 11 and following, that these 3 men appear and they're friends when they hear of all the calamity. Now, in the book of Job, in the King James, you're going to have the word evil pops up a lot. The evil that befell Job, the evil that was Job's lot, the evil that Job was going through. Okay? From the sense of calamity, from the sense of the way you and I would look and say, oh, that's a terrible thing to have happen. So-and-so got cancer. So-and-so was in a car wreck. So-and-so lost all of their life savings. And we would say, that's evil. No, that's just a calamity. But we look at that, say human phrasing. So kind of keep that in mind. Job's 3 friends heard of all the evil that had come upon him, and they all came from their own places. They don't know how far, that's not the point. It was Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite, and they made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. These men heard of the troublous circumstances that Job was going through, and they came to be there to support him. Okay? They sat on the ground with him, verse 13, for an entire week, day and night. Nobody even spoke a word. Okay? And chapter 3 opens with Job's first statement, series of statements that are involved. And we're not going there either. Okay? Yeah, so we're skipping over, obviously, a lot of stuff. Now, in a nutshell, these men came to the conclusion, and their accusations against Job was that they too apparently believed that God, being righteous, would not allow the type of affliction that Job was going through unless Job had committed some type of great sin. Because their idea of a righteous God stopped at the fact of Job receiving what they considered to be punishment, and they said that must be because Job is a sinner in some way. Maybe it hasn't come out yet, maybe it hasn't hit Facebook, and been published, but, we know that because we know it has to be that way, because God, being righteous, would not even think about having a believer go through difficult times like that, right? So the conclusion that they had was that aspect of sin, okay? That's in a nutshell, okay? But if you look at chapter 1, just right at the very end of it, after Job goes through this first big barrage of affliction, difficulty, and so forth that I've already kind of described, Job in verse 20 arose, rent his mantle. That's what's okay. This was the badge of office, so to speak, in some ways. His position, it was an outer garment. He rent it, shaved his head, fell upon the ground, and worshipped. Wow. Okay. after losing everything earthly that has already been described, Job's response was to fall down and worship the God who had taken it all, allowed it to all be taken away. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return. The Lord gives, the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And in all of this, Job did not sin nor charge God foolishly. Okay? So regardless of the affliction, the difficulty, and the trauma, the emotions, the finances, the loss of family, period, you name it, Job remains true in his expression of worship as well. Okay? That's what you have. And then you look back at chapter 2, in verse 9, his wife comes to him and says, do you still retain, are you still hanging on to your integrity, to your belief system? Curse God and die. His response, you speak as like one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we receive good at the hand of God and not receive calamity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. So you have kind of a setting here. In chapter 15, verse 15, but chapter 13, Job's statement was, though he slay me, speaking of God, yet will I trust him. I will maintain my ways before him. He will also be my salvation, my deliverance. For a hypocrite shall not come before him. A hypocrite, the word means godless. Okay, and it's the hypocrisy of pretending you have a relationship with God, okay, but not walking with him, not being obedient and being true. Okay, so a consideration arises with this kind of as throwing out a little background. What did Job know that gave him the ability to respond with such conviction and passion? Job had to have had some understanding that allowed him to bow down and worship when his world was destroyed in all areas of his life. That's just not, well, I go to church when it's convenient. That's just not, I revere God when I'm feeling good. I had a lady tell me one time that this is in the big bubble meltdown thing, of 20 years or so ago in the stock market world. She just quit coming to church. I saw her and asked her how she'd been, what had been going on. And she said, you probably realized I'm no longer coming to church. And I said, well, I noticed your absence, wondered if there was something we might do. And she said, no. She said, when that stock market crashed, she said, I lost $65,000 overnight. And if God's going to treat me like that, I've got no use for him. Well, Job had to know something. He had to know something. He had to have some conviction and something pretty concrete, as far as his perspective was, to be able to go through all of this hardship and difficulty and still remain true to God. Was Job then naive? That's the next question that comes up. Was he naive? Maybe he was just self-deceived. Or was he actually, spiritually speaking, faithful? Well, in chapter 9, it tells us in verse 20, if I attempt to justify myself, my own mouth will condemn me. If I say I am perfect, I will be proven to be perverse. The word perverse means distorted. The literal means being tied in a knot. Okay? It said, I said, if I claim to have all knowledge, if I claim to be sinlessly perfect, if I claim to, he said, if I say I'm right and everybody else is wrong, or however that's manifested. See, Job's understanding of mankind's circumstance, and we've got to pick up right with the scripture reading that David brought to us in chapter 14. this is what Job's understanding of man's state and status was, if you choose to put it that way. And again, briefly, because of time, he begins with a statement. Man that is born of woman is of few days and full of trouble. Okay? That's not a reflection upon your mother's being evil. Okay, whoever gave you birth, I'm assuming you had a mother at some point, but maybe you just crawled out under a rock. I don't know. He said that man's normal, humanity's normal path in life is going to have trouble in it. It's troublesome. There's going to be difficulties. There's going to be calamities. As Job puts it, there's going to be evil. Okay? You get the idea, everything that is here. Because he's going to come just a few days, and he's not going to last long. You know the 70, and if by reason of strength 80 concept. He comes forth like a flower in verse 2, but then he's cut down. He flees like a shadow, and he doesn't last he's here and gone. Here and gone. How James put it. You know, your life is a vapor that appears for a little while and vanishes away. Now, we don't really get that until you understand what he's talking about. It's like putting a tea kettle on the stove, turning on the burner, and waiting until the steam comes out the snout, right? But it comes out and then dissipates. He says that's what your life's like in comparison to eternity, your physical human life. It's here just for that, and it's gone. Okay? That's all there is to it. In other words, it is like a flower, comes onto the scene, grows, blooms, looks pretty, smells good, kind of, some of them do, you know, but then no time at all it withers and it's gone again. That's the package. So he says in verse 4, now here's the problem when it comes to bringing me into judgment from verse 3. Who can bring a clean thing, it's in italics, not there in the original, out of an unclean? There's not a human being alive on the face of the earth that can do that. You can't do it. It's impossibility. You know? Clean doesn't come out of unclean. Yeah, that's just the way it works. See, verse 5 says, seeing his days are determined, the number of his months are with thee, you have appointed the boundaries that he cannot pass. Yeah, he gives this rather gloomy picture of mankind's life on this earth being pretty brief. And there's just not much that mankind can do about it. Even if you live to an old age compared to dying in middle age, compared to dying when you're younger, you know, regardless of a decade here or 2 more decades there, in the light of eternity, it's nothing. It's not even the blink of an eye. And he says, mankind's life is so brief, okay? He says in verse 10, but man dies and wastes away. He gives up the ghost. Where does he go? What happens next? That's the big question here. As the waters fall from the sea and the flood decays, in other words, recedes and dries up after it hits the high water mark, so man lies down and rises not, until the heavens be no more, they do not awake nor raised out of their sleep. Okay? He says, mankind physically dies. He goes, in this picture, okay, goes into the ground, goes into the grave. Okay? He says, but he gives a hint, until the heavens be no more. Mankind he doesn't he's in the grave for 2 years. Or 200 years, and then there's rockets are shot off at 4th of July, and the guy pops up and lives for another 50 years, and it doesn't work that way, does it? Just simply doesn't work that way. Okay? What happens then? What did Job understand about this? Well, verse 13, Job writes, he's talking to God here, Oh, that you would hide me in the grave. I know most of us have never thought about being hidden in the grave. We talk about hiding behind the closet door or hiding under the covers, but as far as hiding in the grave, that thou wouldst keep my secret until your wrath be past, and that you would appoint me a set time and remember me. He's talking much more about just being a corpse in the grave. He's talking about he himself, Job, being remembered even though his physical body is in the grave. He says, if a man die, key concept here in verse 14, if a man die, here's the question, shall he live? The word again is in italics, which means it's not actually there in the original manuscript. If a man dies, is he still alive? Shall he continue to live? Okay. All the days of my appointed time I will wait until my change comes. Now he's saying there is a time after I go into the grave, but there is an appointed time when there's going to be something that changes. Okay. What is it? Verse 15. You will call and I will answer you. You will have a desire for the work that comes from your hands. For now, you are numbering my steps. Aren't you watching my life? My sin, my transgressions are sealed in a bag. And he goes on. But the real question is, if a man dies, then what? Shall he live again? Is there something beyond? Is there life beyond this life? Is there another chapter, or as Paul Harvey used to put it, the rest of the story? Is there more to it than that? Those of you that have had the fun of reading these fast-paced, hold-your-attention type of novels, when you turn off the light at 3:45 in the morning, because you got to see what happens in the next chapter, you just keep going and flipping the pages, until you wake up face down in the book. That's what we're kind of talking about. The question, he says, there's an appointed time, there's going to be a change, there's going to be a call, and I'm going to be answering. In Psalm 90, attributed to Moses, the only one that was the only psalm attributed to Moses, it is written, we are consumed by thine, God's anger, and by thy wrath we are troubled. You have set our iniquities before you, our secret sins in the light of your countenance, for all our days are passed away in your wrath. We spend our years as a tale that is told. The days of our years are 70, if by reason of strength 80. Yet is their strength labor and sorrow. It is soon cut off. We fly away. And the conclusion, a couple of verses later, is teach us to number our days and to apply our hearts unto wisdom. Okay. So Moses had a grasp on some of these same truths, these same concepts, even the centuries that were there. In chapter 15, the very opening statement here is Eliphaz. Okay, I know, that's one of those guys. In verse 1 and 2, Job is answered by one of his friends, the Temanite, saying, should a wise man utter vain knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? He just called Job a blithering idiot. I realize we don't speak this way, and we have to kind of translate it as we go, but he says, you're just spouting nonsense. All this stuff about change and living again, and God calling him at the end of the days, and he says, man, you're just grasping at just emotional band-aids out there or something. He said, I don't know where you're getting this, but your head is full of fluff. He says, you just don't get it. It's Eliphaz that didn't get it. Jesus, when he met Martha on his way to the tomb of Lazarus, said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believes in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And whosoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Believest thou this? Yeah. Well, he didn't say you're going to be dead and then I'm going to give you another chance at life. He said, no. He said, whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. He's not talking about your physical body, the physical aspect of believers. He's talking about what we would call the spirit, soul, consciousness. You see, the physical carcass, from the day you're born, you're dying. Okay? From the day you are created in your mother's womb, you're dying. Okay? Yeah, because of the sin nature of mankind, the decay is automatically built into the fallen human nature of man, and that fallen nature is manifested by decay and death. That is a picture. Okay? Every time you go to a funeral, you are witnessing the effects of sin. I'm not saying that the individual is Attila the Hun, or Genghis Khan, or Adolf Hitler. I'm saying that mankind's lot is man born of woman is born of trouble. That's the way Job put it. Okay? Romans puts it, wherefore as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, therefore death is passed upon all men, for all have sinned. All are created in the mother's womb because they have a male father. Jesus, of course, had to be born of a virgin, and he did not have a human father from the physical point of view. So you see how God dealt with that. Well, turn over, if you would, to chapter 19 for just a moment. Because here you have Job's conviction. We see this man as having a grasp on a couple of great eternal truths concerning mankind, his physical destiny, and everything involved in that. In chapter 19, it tells us, beginning in verse 23, oh, that my words were now written. Oh, that they were printed in a book. Little did the guy know, right? And, here we are today reading the words that were recorded about him. Now, I don't know whether God is keeping track. It tells us that, we are going to have to give an account for every idle word. So somehow, God is utilizing that great AI computer in the sky, Google Chat GPT XC 904, whatever it is. But some of us, including me, have got some pieces of conversation that I just as soon hit erase on. Let's just block out that text and push delete real quick, because I just assume God didn't remember that part, but we'll leave that up to God. Job here, oh, that they were printed in a book, that they were graven with an iron pen and lead in the rock forever. Well, that's exactly what happened, is God put these words down, and here they are thousands of years later. In verse 25, Job writes, I know my Redeemer lives, and he will stand at the appointed time upon the earth. And though even after the worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself. My eyes will behold, not through another's, but though my reins be consumed within me. And you think, wait a minute, reins, what's that? Reins literally means kidneys. He's talking about the essential organs for life itself. That's the meaning that is there. Okay? He said it doesn't matter whether the earthly body is totally wiped out, like you burn up in a fire, you fall overboard off an ocean liner and the fish eat you, you're blown up in an explosion, or you just wither away and become worm food in a coffin someplace. It makes no difference whatsoever. Okay? But it's Job's understanding, Job's faith, Job's commitment with this was, he says, I know my Redeemer lives. Okay? And his confidence wasn't in something that Job was able to do. No, he had faith that his Redeemer lived and that his Redeemer would stand at the appointed time on the earth. Okay? So he's saying that the one who provides redemption, the righteous God of the universe, is the one who is going to cause this to happen. He's going to redeem me. Now, in its context, he's talking about redemption from the grave, being rescued, from being worm food. Okay? He's going to be resurrected. That's what he's talking about. He's going to stand with his Redeemer at the end of days. Everything that goes with that. Job answering Bildad in chapter 26, and I just threw this one in because it's so good. Job's response was, speaking of God, he stretches out the north over the empty place and hangs the earth upon nothing. He binds up the waters in thick clouds. The cloud is not rent under them. And there's much, much, much more in there. He's talking about the Creator God. And he's saying, since God created this entire globe out of nothing, he just thought it into existence. He said, the God that I know can easily bring me back from the grave, redeem me, and have me stand on the earth with him in the future. Okay? So that's what he's talking about. So a summary of the remainder of the book. Well, the next 200 sermons will go, no, we're not doing that. It's, Job is not a guy who had everything nailed down perfectly in his life. Just like you and just like me. We don't have it down perfectly, do we? Okay. Elihu, that's the fourth guy. Okay. Three friends plus an associate. We don't really know. But Elihu appears in chapter 32 to rebuke Job, who had made the mistake of justifying himself rather than glorifying God. Now, about that, that's another story for another time. Okay? There's a lot in the book of Job. And regardless of Job's struggles in that area, God never gave up on Job. He reprimanded him, he rebuked him out of the whirlwind described in chapter 37, and it resulted in Job getting a clear picture of what Job looked like through the eyes of God. Okay? The mistake sometimes we make in our humanity, even as believers, is the same that Job could have made. I have 3 friends who all are saying so and so, but I know better, and my line of reasoning is more logical and more complete than theirs. Therefore, I can discard their arguments against my circumstance, and in doing so, I will justify myself. And God comes by and says, I don't grade on the curve. Your righteousness is not gained by you being more logical, more intellectual, or more knowledgeable than your 3 friends. So God sends Elihu to speak for him, as it were. And then God finally speaks out of the whirlwind. The conclusion is that Job actually comes to grips with how God sees him and repents in sackcloth and ashes. Just crawls into the dirt and says, I can't argue with God. I simply am not worthy. I'm vile. I'm a wretched creature. That's what the Apostle Paul said, O wretched man that I am, who shall deliver me from the body of this death? He didn't try to justify himself or compare himself with being better than someone else. He just said, compared to the one and only one who is truly righteous, I'm a worm. So when genuine believers see themselves as God sees them, compared to his righteousness, they give up on the idea of, I'm not such a bad person after all. You know? Because, yeah, I know I'm better than Charlie or Frank or whoever. Well, compared to what? So God wouldn't be fair if he saved so-and-so and didn't save me. Fair is a human invention. It's a construction by mankind's philosophy. The Bible doesn't deal with God being fair. The Bible deals with God being righteous and holy and just. And those are pretty demanding concepts. God wound up rewarding Job, both spiritually and materially. Wealth returned, lost family replaced, Satan defeated. It's kind of interesting that Satan appears for the second and last time in chapter 2, and you never hear from him again. So again, more to the story? Yeah, some other time. Okay? A future resurrection hope. And there are many Old Testament examples. King David, you remember after that great sin with Bathsheba, and the child of Bathsheba's was born, never named. The child was born, and then after a week died. David's comment was, he said, I will see him again. He said, I will go where he is. He can't come to me, but I can go to him. Okay. Daniel, at the very last verse of the book of Daniel, he says this. God gives him the instruction. Go your way until the end of days. You will rest, meaning go to the grave. Then stand in your lot at the end of those days. Okay. See, there were the resurrection. How was Job then able to fall down and worship after having lost everything that most of us would consider of any earthly value whatsoever? Okay. Well, he knew his Redeemer lived. He knew he would stand before his Savior when the time came at the end of days. That's called anticipation. That's not called wishful thinking. Job was simply anticipating what God had promised would happen. Okay? So you have the crucifixion that David presents, but you also have the anticipation that goes beyond earthly life and even earthly death that the believer can have confidence in. Father, thank you as we bow before you, asking that you would touch our hearts, allow us to rejoice in this same sense of anticipation, that we can know, as Job said, I know my Redeemer lives. And we praise you for that in his name. Amen.